Simcoe North.
Good afternoon, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise here in this chamber, as it always is, to talk about a very important issue affecting Canadians, which is affordability, the cost of living, and our opposition and the Conservatives' opposition day motion. Before I talk about the motion, I'd just like to set some context for individuals who are here. Food prices have increased 9.7%. Fuel, in many cases, is up, depending on what time you measure it, almost 65, 70%. In some cases, diesel has doubled in about 12 months. Retail prices, the price that you pay for clothing and other goods, is also significantly high. It's also important to recognize that we were on an incredibly high trajectory of inflation before the war in Ukraine started. Inflation was 5.5%, which was a 25-year high in February before the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. So to suggest that, it is all explained now by the war, I think misses the point that we were on a quite high inflation trajectory before that started. Now, full disclosure, and I will concede the points to my members across the way, that there are multiple reasons for the cause of inflation. Of course, there are supply chain issues. Of course, there is the war. But there are also serious structural issues that are leading to inflation. By its definition, a consumption tax is inflationary. The Bank of Canada even says this. At least a half a percentage point of inflation can be attributed to the carbon tax, according to the Bank of Canada. The challenge that I have, or perhaps some of my members on this side of the House, is that every time questions about inflation or cost of living or affordability have been raised, they're waved away. They're explained away by these external factors that are out of the government's control. But I don't believe that to be true, Madam Speaker. Yes, there are things that are outside of the government's control, and I just mentioned a few of them. But there are simple things that this government could do to provide immediate relief to Canadians. It's the challenge about not acknowledging that inflation is perhaps not transitory. I mean, if you take a long enough view, everything is transitory. Even life is transitory, Madam Speaker, if you take a long enough view. The challenge is the facts are changing on the ground. And this government now is out of step with the rest of the world because they have yet to acknowledge the challenge of inflation and the tools that they have to do it. In fact, just last week, President Biden wrote an op-ed to the American people where he vowed to take action on inflation immediately and provided a three-point plan on how to deal with inflation that the federal government in the United States was going to deal with, and acknowledged that, of course, the central banks have a role to play. Secretary Yellen said last week in an interview that she was wrong about inflation, that inflation was persisting longer than they thought. We've also heard this from the Federal Reserve Chair in the U.S. We've also heard this from Bank of Canada officials have admitted they all underestimated inflation, but not from this government. This government refuses to even acknowledge that it might be behind the curve. I think Canadians would appreciate a little bit of humility to just say, look, we were a little bit slow on the inflation front, but we have tools that we can use to combat inflation. The question that I have every day, Madam Speaker, is how long does inflation need to persist for, or how high does inflation need to get before the government realizes that it must act? Now, Madam Speaker, we've put forward an opposition day motion, which I think some would even call an omnibus motion, with some interesting ideas. I feel in the interest of constructive discussion in this House, there may be some things that individuals feel strongly opposed to, but they are ideas. And the government would feel free to take any of these ideas they would like and act on them. We don't need to pass this entire motion. It doesn't sound like we'll have support from some other parties. But certainly, Madam Speaker, there are some reasonable ideas. I'd like to highlight a couple for you today that speak to me. With respect to suspending the GST on fuel, regular gasoline and diesel, if you just consider diesel for a moment, the price of diesel has doubled in 12 months, or maybe 16 months. That also means that the HST that the government receives on diesel has also doubled. The revenue that the government makes is doubled because the price has doubled. HST is applied right before you pay the final price. In fact, the government has never made so much money than it is making right now. In fact, that's why I have significant challenges with the answer to inflation being, oh, well, we have to tax companies more because we can take that money and do something with it. The government doesn't need that money. The government has never made so much money than they're making right now. In fact, if you consider the budget of 2021, what they believed the government to be making in terms of revenues over the next 5 years, and you compare budget 22 with the revenue that they're going to be receiving now, the government has found an extra $170 billion. Wow. The question is, what are they doing with it? Why are they not returning that to Canadians? It's coming from Canadians in the first place. So, Madam Speaker, I think we have to be just a little bit more realistic and pragmatic that increasing taxes on companies isn't going to all of a sudden solve our inflation problem. We've got a bunch of extra revenues now and we still have inflation. So making the government bigger is not the answer to our worries. The honourable colleague from Foothills talked about fertilizer, and I'll mention it just for a moment because of the significant farming community in Simcoe North. I have phone calls every day, and I visit farms and talk to farmers in my riding, and they say, you know, we want to help Ukraine. We want to do our part for Ukraine. We don't mind about paying a fertilizer tariff on fertilizer that's purchased after March 2nd. But they paid for fertilizer in December. They prepaid for fertilizer, and yet they're still being hit with this tariff. That the government didn't even understand the impact of that tariff before it brought it in and had very clear, defined rules that it has clarified shows a lack of understanding or an unwillingness to understand about the farming community, Madam Speaker. Now, there is an element of this motion to talk about money laundering, and some of you are saying, why are we talking about money laundering? That's such a long-term problem. This is incredible. Well, you know what, Madam Speaker? The best day to plant a tree, if not yesterday, is today. And the Cullen Commission is going to have an 1,800-page report, which I hope becomes public very soon, about the challenges of money laundering in British Columbia. But it's going to expose a significant challenge nationally that we must take head on. And we have to understand the impact of money laundering, especially in our real estate sector, because it distorts our real estate markets. In Aurelia, which is in Simcoe North, we have seen a 300% increase in the price of housing in 6 years. That is unsustainable. I believe that some of that is due to the distorting effects of money laundering in our big cities because people are now moving out and looking into other places. So, Madam Speaker, it's with this context that I think most of these ideas here in our motion are quite reasonable. And as I say, maybe we don't expect this motion to pass. I hope we have a great debate, but I would welcome the government to take any of these ideas as their own. In closing, Madam Speaker, I'll make a brief comment about leadership. True leadership is recognizing that perhaps your original plan needs to change when the facts on the ground change. True leadership is showing a level of humility that humans can sometimes get some things wrong. There are interesting examples from just the previous government, and I'll mention just three. When the government decided to change its mind and tax income trust, that was in the face of different facts changing on the ground. It reversed its decision on interest income affordability. And, Madam Speaker, when the global financial crisis hit, the government reversed its ideological position on running deficits and saved Canada from significant financial ruin. So thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for offering me this opportunity today.